Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus is a name usually synonymous in the public consciousness with Gaius Julius Caesar and the titanic struggle that was Caesar's civil war fought during the twilight of the Roman Republic. Yet Pompey, as he's commonly known in English today, was an equally influential figure of his time, vastly expanding Roman territory, commanding the love and loyalty of thousands of legionaries, and, in his prime, as much, if not more, of a maverick than his eventual nemesis, Julius Caesar. Unlike most treatments of the man, I shall today focus on Pompey's life and career before Caesar, specifically today his remarkable rise to literal triumph in Rome, the victor of 2 campaigns, and all without even holding high office, or even being a senator. This is not to suggest a rags to riches tale. Pompey was by no means a man of the people, actually being born into a noble family of the gens Pompeia in Picenum, Italy. Pompey's father, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, had progressed well on the cursus honorum, the ladder of political offices, serving as quaestor in 104 BC, praetor in 92 BC, before finally reaching the greatest office of consul, the rough equivalent of a modern head of state, in 89 BC. Pompey's father was thus wealthy, influential, and yet somewhat of an outsider, considered a novo homus, or new man, having just 2 names, unlike the patrician free. Strabo fought in the Social War, a conflict between Rome and its Italian allies, the Socii, who wanted full citizenship. He took Asculum by siege as consul in 89 BC. However, though Strabo was a competent leader, he wasn't very popular, failing to win the hearts of his men, or win over many senatorial allies for that matter, instead cultivating an unfortunate reputation for greed. At the outbreak of war, Strabo had no solid connection with the leaders of either camp. In 88 BC, Strabo had already celebrated a triumph in Rome, and had retired to his native Picenum, though significantly with his army. Pompey, through all this, had served under his father since about 89, though not much is noted of his doings during this time. Strabo had attempted to mimic the great Marius by serving a 2nd consecutive term as consul in 88, though another man, Quintus Pompeius Rufus, possibly a distant relation there, replaced him. Sulla, also newly elected consul, and the Senate, then moved to have command of Strabo's army transferred to Rufus, though the attempt quickly unravelled. Rufus did make it to the army, but was lynched by the soldiers, likely at the instigation of Strabo himself. Most of the men had been raised in Strabo's native Picenum and were tied to him, if not loving of him. With Rufus gone, Strabo immediately resumed command and kept them aloof in Picenum, while events elsewhere played out between the 2 Marian and Sullan camps. Though slow to take sides, he did eventually side with Sulla, not interfering on the latter's march on Rome in 88 BC, but moving on the city a year later at the Senate's request when Marius and Cinna attacked it. Strabo didn't fully commit even then to any attack on the Marian faction, ordering a lukewarm action against Quintus Sertorius to the north of the city, which really came to nothing. Strabo's death was far more exciting, according to one version by Plutarch that states he was randomly struck by lightning, though it's actually far more likely that the general died of dysentery or disease, due to the poor hygienic conditions of his camp outside the Column Gate of Rome itself. What happened next was quite shocking, though in differing ways. Strabo was so hated, even by his own men, that his funeral was mobbed and his corpse desecrated, though the young Pompey did step in to stop this after a time. But then what happened, which was perhaps more shocking in a more positive way, were the actions of Pompey. Unlike his father, the youth was popular with his men. His charisma, enough to have even thwarted a collapse of Strabo's army after a failed assassination attempt on the latter, then persuaded the majority of Strabo's soldiers not to flee the camp by apparently throwing himself in the gateway, suggesting the would-be deserters trample him to death to escape. Immediately following Strabo's death, Pompey entered Rome, only to be prosecuted for his own involvement in the misappropriation of the plunder seized from Asculum. The trial proved another key moment in the youth's public life. Another of his father's men was actually blamed. Pompey was acquitted largely due to the skill of his defenders, but also based off his own conduct, his good looks, and just his sheer charisma. The judge, it seems, a praetor in Rome, was actually so impressed that he actually betrothed Pompey to his own daughter. Word of this fact quickly spread, so that it was said that when the verdict was given, the gathered crowd shouted "Talasio," an equivalent to the modern "You may now kiss the bride." With Sulla out of Rome and the city very much under the control of the Marian faction, Pompey felt it prudent to return to his native Picenum. During this period, Pompey forged his earliest links with the informal Optimate party. His father, Strabo, had already moved the young man in this direction, opposing the Marian Populares faction before his death. These labels are largely that, modern conveniences. Optimates, or the party of the best men, as they called themselves, were the conservative faction, effectively led at this time by Sulla, the former legate of Gaius Marius. Optimates favoured use and maintenance of the power of the Senate, with established patrician families key figures. The Populares were more partial to the use of the public assemblies to forward policy, and were willing to subvert the established powers and prerogatives of the Senate, and appealed directly to the masses and common soldiery for influence. Gaius Marius's so-called reforms during his years as a victorious general fighting the Jugurthine and Cimbrian wars placed him very much within the latter camp, enabling poorer, unpropertied men into the legions, creating armies of professional men, as opposed to the former militia forces of earlier times. Before these reforms truly began to take effect, Roman armies had been manned by propertied freemen, the men of the army usually small-holding farmers that fought brief campaigns earlier on in Rome's expansion. Since most campaigns were close to Rome, this was actually quite feasible. A man could serve for a few months and return to his farm to bring in the harvest. However, as the Roman Republic's borders expanded beyond Italia, so too did the length of service required of its soldiers. Campaigns lengthened and farms thus began to fall into ruin and be sold off, a lot of the time to richer landowners. Roman successes over enemies like Macedonia and Carthage also increased the amount of slaves imported, which were put to work on ever-increasing latifundia, or large estates, owned by the equites and senatorial classes. Thus by Pompey's time, and even before actually, manpower of the army was depleting as fewer men qualified to serve. Land too was being brought up, leaving ordinary men to move increasingly into the cities, including Rome itself. Marius had instituted several changes to mitigate the military implications of all this. Most importantly for us was the standardization of equipment and the removal of the property qualification. Yet such a change also created a strong bond between the men and their general. Now the armies of the Republic would be largely comprised of poor men whose hope of fortune through plunder and eventual settlement on land was tied to the success, both militarily and politically, of their general. Obviously, Optimates were, as a rule, opposed to any change in the status quo, the most powerful of them happy to keep their huge fortunes and estates, as well as the power they wielded through the aristocratic Senate. Marius, as a homo novus, and having a string of military successes and successive consulships, was opposed to Sulla, who had spent the years after his initial march on Rome fighting in Pontus. It had been command of this conflict in the east that had finally ignited the personal rivalry between the elderly Marius and his former legate into a full-blown conflict. Despite his age, he was nearly 70 at the time, Marius had conspired to have the command, initially given to Sulla, transferred to himself, prompting Sulla to march on Rome for the first time in 88 BC. After his departure east, the Marians had quickly seized back control, though by 83 BC, Sulla was poised to return. Pompey around this time actually decided to initially join the Marian establishment under Cinna, though given his father's former allegiances, he was treated with much suspicion and so returned to Picenum. Cinna effectively took over sole leadership of the Marian faction in 86, with the death of his fellow consul Marius himself, just 17 days after he had been elected to the office for a 7th time. Cinna's time soon expired though, his own men murdering him in a mutiny, sole command of the opposition to Sulla being assumed by Gnaeus Papirius Carbo. Marius's retaking of Rome was bloody to say the least, with many powerful families suffering murder and confiscation of property at Marius and Cinna's hands, creating a ready-made domestic opposition when Sulla eventually landed at Brundisium in 83. It was at this point that Pompey, all of 23 years old, and with no office or experience of sole military command, began to recruit men from his own region of Picenum. This should not be understated. Roman armies were very much tied to and structured by the political system. Praetors and consuls commanded armies, not private citizens. Regardless, however, Pompey cautiously proceeded to muster men, as his own father had done. His own position as the wealthiest landowner, as well as his father's reputation, along with his own charisma, eliciting an enthusiastic response. Carbo did attempt to break this up by sending his own agents, but these were wholly ineffective. Pompey showed an early flash of his organisational genius by creating an entire legion along with some cavalry. He appointed centurions and crafted his army into cohorts in the appropriate manner, funding all of this, purchasing the equipment and paying his soldiers' wages with his own personal fortune. More than this, he also footed the bill for the food and transportation, eventually amassing 2 more legions on top of this. 3 legions now stood ready under his command, a command he actually had no legal authority to have. Pompey moved south to support the Sullan side, beating off several attempts to intercept him. Sulla's reception of him was in marked contrast to Cinna's, proconsul dismounting from his steed to greet the young man, even hailing him as Imperator, an appellation traditionally awarded to a victorious general. Sulla, it seems, was quite taken with Pompey, always making a point of acknowledging him by rising from his seat when he appeared, not something he by any means universally did. Pompey fought in the north with another Sullan commander, Metellus, while Sulla himself took Rome. Sulla was initially lured out of Rome by Carbo's Samnite allies, but won a decisive victory at the Colline Gate, cementing his control. After the victory, Sulla had himself made dictator to restore the Republic. Yet significantly, there was no term limit placed on his office. Traditionally, this had been 6 months, and the office had been used only in the direst hours of the Republic, such as during the Second Punic War. Sulla set the theme of his own treatment of enemies by immediately having all the Samnite allies taken during the battle massacred. He proved the equal of Marius and Cinna in his brutality towards his own political enemies, creating lists of men, proscribing those enemies that could be killed and their property seized. Sulla also instituted various reforms. He doubled the size of Rome's Senate, increasing it to around 600 members. He severely reduced the powers of the tribunate, thus blunting some of the power of the plebeians, as well as making the office unattractive, barring holders of it from later progressing to higher offices. Furthermore, age limits and term restrictions were also imposed on the magistracies and governorships too. For example, no man could serve as consul till the age of 42, with a window of 10 years between each term as well. Sulla's new powers also touched the young Pompey on a personal level too. Pompey had been married to Antistia since 86, but now it seems Sulla wanted to tie his promising young general to him for solid family connection, ordering that he divorce his wife. He gave in her place Aemilia, his own stepdaughter. That she was heavily pregnant was glossed over. Soon after the marriage, his new wife died, but the symbolic act was made nonetheless. Pompey really was Sulla's man. By 81 BC, the war was effectively over in Italy, but the remnants of the Marian faction endured in some of the provinces, Sicily, Africa and Spain. Sulla assigned Pompey to take on Marcus Paperna, this time even giving the young general his first official command, the Senate granting him pro-praetorian imperium. The campaign though was swift, if unexciting, Paperna simply running away. There was one notable capture though, of Carbo himself. Sicily's cities had been treated poorly by the Marians, though Pompey was careful to act with kindness, while such treatment was certainly not extended to his Marian counterparts. Having based himself in Lilybaeum, he clapped him in chains and hauled him before a tribunal overseen by himself, before having him executed, to the outrage of many, some even dubbing him the adolescent butcher. It's important to say though that in contrast, Pompey was actually believed to have acted with more restraint than some of Sulla's other lieutenants. Sicily proved only the beginning of a series of campaigns in the life of Pompey that would cement his name in the history books. While there, Sulla sent orders for Pompey to sail for Africa to fight Gnaeus Domitius Anabarbus. He landed at Utica near Carthage, where another enemy quickly beset Pompey's men, avarice. Soon after landing, to the eventual amusement of Pompey, a group of Pompeians discovered a hoard of Punic coins. and a gold rush inevitably took hold, rumours of other Carthaginians having buried treasure spreading through the ranks. Over several days, Pompey simply lost control of his troops, even seeing the funny side by laughing at his excitedly digging men. However, after the mania had died down, it was back to business. Upon Pompey's arrival, several thousand enemy soldiers promptly defected to him, though the force that remained under Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus was still formidable, numbering around 20,000. In addition, the Marians were supported by the Numidian king, Iarbas. Marching out of his camp, Ahenobarbus drew up for battle on some high ground overlooking a ravine, though Pompey did not initially move to attack. On the day of battle, a storm raged for the better part of the day too, which may have prompted the Marian general's decision, along with Pompey's apparent reluctance to fight, to withdraw back to his own camp. It was on seeing Ahenobarbus's withdrawal that Pompey ordered his own men forward, crossing to the enemy position and engaging in a confused melee. It's possible too that the wind had shifted, driving the rain into the faces of the Marian soldiers, though the fighting was likely just generally confused, given Pompey himself was almost killed by one of his own men when he failed to answer a challenge from a nervous sentry quickly enough. Having caught Ahenobarbus's lines largely out of formation though, Pompey's men had the better of the fighting, with only 3,000 or so of the initial 20,000 enemy troops surviving this onslaught. Ahenobarbus himself did manage to make it back to his camp, while Pompey's men halted and hailed him Imperator. However, despite the likely warm feeling that flowed through him at the praise, Pompey stonily ordered his men on to the enemy camp, wanting to decisively crush resistance. The final assault indeed saw Ahenobarbus killed and the Marian army conclusively defeated. The fall of Ahenobarbus, though, was quickly followed up with an invasion of Numidia. Iarbas fled west, but was pincered by both Pompey coming from the east and King Mauretania moving in from the west. Luckily for Pompey, Hiempsal, a rival for the Numidian throne, who had been deposed by Iarbas, was available to replace the enemy king. According to a later account, Iarbas was captured at Bulla in eastern Numidia and killed. Hiempsal was installed as a safe ruler, his father having been a Sullan ally. Pompey's African campaign was thus a complete success, highlighted the more by his youth. His troops had enthusiastically hailed him Imperator, which if Pompey had actually held official praetorian or consular rank, would even entitle him to a triumph with the Senate's approval. All this had aged around 25, and within 40 days of his landing. As might be no surprise given his own background to power, Sulla's feelings on his young protegee's success were decidedly mixed. He was likely pleased both Sicily and Africa were brought back into the fold, but also concerned at Pompey's success and his men's adulation of him. Could he have created a new rival for his own power and influence? Soon after Utica, Sulla sent word to Pompey to remain in Africa with a single legion, instructing him to send on the rest to Italy. Apparently, far from harbouring ambitions for the top job, it was Pompey's own men who violently objected to this plan, Pompey's men seeing this as a slight to their commander. Soon, Pompey was flooded with demands that he lead them back to Italy. Pompey responded by mounting the tribunal, a structure always constructed in the centre of Roman camps, tried unsuccessfully to calm his men. Much like the scenes after the failed assassination of his father, he gave up and stormed off tearily, supposedly distraught in his tent. However, after sufficient coaxing, he returned to the platform, finally convincing them back to discipline by swearing to kill himself rather than raise arms against Sulla. Pompey did, however, accompany them back to Italy. Sulla likely sweated back in Rome on the likelihood of another civil war. He himself had marched on the Eternal City with just 6 legions, and now a much younger, bloodied and newly acclaimed man was returning with similar numbers. Yet, as you might have gathered, given we don't read today of Pompey the Dictator, the young general's loyalties had not shifted to Sulla's likely relief. The dictator warmly met Pompey outside of Rome. He immediately bestowed on Pompey the title he would be forever known by, the Great. Plutarch later wrote that the victorious general did not openly use the title for some years, though this seems a bit unlikely. Despite such informal praise, Pompey requested and expected a triumph. Pompey's plans for his own triumph were suitably grandiose, his intent being to ride through Rome on a great chariot drawn by elephants, though this intention was soon scuppered by the realization that the gates would not fit such a vehicle. As you may have guessed then, triumphs were a huge deal for any man of the senatorial class, usually the province though of praetors and consuls, much older men, and on paper way above the pay grade of the young Pompey, who was not even enrolled as a senator yet, let alone on the cursus honorum. Sulla had also legislated as much, making triumphs the preserve of praetors and consuls. Despite all this, Sulla was no fool and reluctantly agreed in principle. Pompey's men were still grumbling over the issue, and also due to rumours that the loot of their campaign had not been properly distributed. Pompey stepped in to call their bluff, threatening to forego the event entirely, which was as much an honour for the parading soldiers as for the general. This worked, subduing his mutinous men and allowing the event to proceed. So it was that, at just 25 years old, Pompey, newly christened the Great, won his first triumph, having raised, commanded and fought with his own legions in 2 campaigns, a remarkable feat that even his more famous rival, Julius Caesar, would not equal.